I want to go one more place. Can you help me? I want to go and click on that icon right there.
He left because he knew it would get sketchy. Oh.
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it at all.
No, I got it.
If you can click on that one. Yep, that one right there. Should be a link if it's not clicking. Okay, never mind. We're good. That's it. All right, guys. I am out of time. So y'all got through how many? How many did y'all get through? Y'all got through 25. We're going to go through as many as we can to get to the ones I want you to see. And we're done. Do you have any other questions? Thank you. If you did or did not like this presentation, you can go to www.comsonics.com, do the communication customer login. There's a tech support. I'm the only Tony in the tech support thing. Literally, it's click on the technician and tell him what you have to do, because short of what he tells my boss has only ever seen me do anything like this 2 times in the last 20 years. Thank you for your time and your attention. You are live.
Okay. Quick 5 guys, and we'll be back on. Just get to talk.
Oh, yeah. You good? Can you hear me?
Oh, why do you know their ages?
If I do, if I want to draw something, can you see that on the video? The one
Which one, the left one or the right one? I
Which
can
one-
do whatever
which
one.
one's
I'll
better?
zoom in whatever one you want.
Okay.
Are you right-handed or left-handed?
Right.
Well, then you'd be good to go.
Oh yeah, I've been on kind of line like a couple weeks now. So we'll see
It would take the energy because you're opening the gateway, right? Consider this to be a key. Once you open the key, whatever's on the other side of the door can come in, right? And so it's the same thing. You're stomping on the lid. You're stomping that thing, right? It's large enough. So you can also momentarily chirp, and that's not lit. You have to have a stand. Thank you.
See
All
ya.
right, the sooner we get started, the sooner we get out of here. Who wants to wait? If you want to go ahead and get started, I'll get those guys back in there.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Taylor from Springbok.
Good afternoon.
No, you're all right. Was it on that one, I think? Try it.
There we go.
There you go. See, look at me.
There you go. I'm Taylor Borchert with Springbok Instruments. Today we're going to learn a few things about TDRs. So you can use a TDR for a lot of things. Locating open, shorts, splices, taps, amplifiers. Basically, you can shoot through any sort of metallic cable, and you can go through any device, any passive device. So splices, you cannot go through any active devices like any amplifiers. You can see them, but you can't go through them. Here's some examples of different TDRs. So Springbok Tracker Pro, the Greenlee, or now Tempo, TV220, the Resorbon 1205. So just examples of different TDRs. The way a TDR works is it works kind of like a closed circuit radar. It sends a pulse of energy down a cable, and it measures impedance mismatches. So it will show open, shorts, and it times how long it takes that pulse of energy as it's traveling down the cable. It times how long it takes to get to a fault and reflect back to it, and then it converts that time to distance. That's basically how all TDRs work. What it's measuring is impedance. So it's the relationship of two pieces of metal on any type of cable. So you've got your center conductor and your in your jacket, and it's measuring that relationship between those two pieces of metal. So if you have any impedance mismatches, like the gentleman was talking about earlier, like if you've got a staple that's crushing that cable, that's going to cause a change in that relationship. So the larger that change, so if you've got a very small, amount of crush, it's going to show up on the TDR as a smaller visual reflection. Whereas, if you have a complete open where it's completely, the energy is being completely absorbed by the end of cable, a complete open, that's going to appear like a very large impedance mismatch. So these are just different types of cable that you can use a TDR in. I mean, for what you guys are using, it's mostly going to be coax, different lengths. But again, this is just kind of illustrating the differences of how you can use a TDR, different types of cable. So the velocity of propagation is basically, it is measuring how quickly a given piece of cable can carry a signal compared to the speed of light. So if you had a perfect piece of cable with no resistance on it, and it was carrying a signal at the speed of light, your VOP would be, anyone know what the VOP would be then? 100%, that's exactly right. But all cable has resistance on it, so it's slowing down that signal. Whoa, yeah. Sorry, the animation's not working. This is just basically showing that, if you've got a slow signal, the ball would be dropping slowly. If you've got a fast piece of cable, it's gonna go. The ball will drop a little bit faster. In this illustration, the one on the left would with a slower viscosity, where the ball is dropping slower, that medium, the liquid, is the cable, whereas the ball is the energy, that pulse of energy that's going down the cable. So it's just trying to illustrate, different VOPs for different types of cable. Now, there's a couple of different ways you can determine. VOP can change on any given piece of cable with a couple of different factors: the age of the cable, the temperature of the cable, and the humidity, and then different manufacturing runs. So even if you know what the manufacturer's recommended VOP for a piece of cable is, that can change with these factors. So it's important to understand not only what the manufacturer recommends what the VOP is, but how to determine it even if it's changed because of these factors. So a couple of different ways you can do that. If you have an accurate plant map, and I realize that a lot of times those plant maps are inaccurate, but it'll at least get you close. If you shoot a piece of cable and the plant map says that it's supposed to be 250 feet, what you can do is hook up your TDR, find the end of the cable, put your cursor on the end of the cable, and then adjust your VOP until it gets close to what the plant map says. And then any faults that are in the middle of that cable will then get you closer on your VOP. Again, plant maps can be inaccurate at times. So the very best way, what we always recommend whenever possible, is to shoot that cable from both ends. What that allows you to do is a couple of things. If you don't know the VOP, you can shoot the cable, and if you've got a fault that, let's say it's showing it's 120 feet out from your left-hand side of the cable, and then if you go around to the other side of the cable and shoot it and it says that it's 265 feet away, when you wheel off and measure the lengths from both directions, if your VOP is exactly correct, then you will have those two measurements on the ground in the exact same location. But regularly, there's other factors outside of our control. As an example, like how far down under the ground it's going, if your VOP is slightly off, if you've got any sort of movement in the cable underground, those two measurements from the left and the right-hand side are going to be slightly off. And so you're going to have those two marks on the ground in different locations. And so then what you'd like to do is just dig right in between those two marks, and you'll get a much more accurate location. Another reason to shoot the cable from both ends is due to your pulse width that's dissipating over distance. So faults that are further away from you are going to appear smaller. So it's important to shoot from both directions, because if you've got especially on a long piece of cable, if you've got a fault that's on the far end, when you go and shoot it from the other direction, it's going to be more visually apparent. Some TDRs will have a list of cable types. This is another way to determine your VOP. If you know what the manufacturer, what the type of cable that you're shooting, a lot of times in the menu you can find that. Pulse width. So just like I was saying earlier, a TDR is sending a pulse of energy down that cable. Now, it's important whenever you're shooting cable to always start with your narrowest pulse width. Even if you're shooting a long piece of cable, you want to start with your narrowest pulse, because it's going to show smaller faults that are closer to you. They'll be easier to see using a narrow pulse. So even if you're shooting 1,500 feet, it's a good idea, because your pulse of energy, as it's traveling down that cable, if you've got a fault that's only 100 feet away, it's going to give you better resolution if you use a narrow pulse. Now, you can see here we've got a 2 nanosecond pulse, a 10 nanosecond, and a 100 nanosecond pulse. This is just kind of visually showing you what the differences are. And it's also showing that you might have a blind spot. So on the very top, you can see with the 2 nanosecond, it's a very narrow pulse, and so you're having a small blind spot. So you'll be able to see faults that are only a couple feet away, 4 or 5 feet away. Whereas if you're using a 10 nanosecond pulse, those faults that are close to you, you might miss that inside of that pulse width. This is just kind of a graph showing you basically what those blind spots are, and then the footage range. So that pulse width, as it's traveling down the cable, because of the loss on the cable, that pulse width is dissipating over distance. So it's getting smaller and smaller as it's traveling down the cable. So it's important to understand, the footage range, and these footage ranges can be really affected by the type of cable that you're using. So this is, again, just kind of a rough summary, but again, always start with the narrowest pulse. And if you're shooting a long piece of cable, start with that narrow pulse, and then work your way up using wider pulse widths to see what you can see. So this is just kind of an order of operations for what you want to do when you're TDRing cable. So hook the cable that you're hook up the cable that you're testing. Determine what your VOP is. Change the VOP to the correct VOP for that cable type. A lot of TDRs will have an auto search. Again, that you kind of have to use that with a grain of salt. Make sure you understand what the cable that you're using, but see if that finds any faults that you're not seeing visually. Auto search or test words are, depending on the manufacturer's type, those are just kind of two different functions on there. Range in and out to see what you can see, zoom in and then zoom out. And it's important, again, to understand that a TDR is measuring impedance mismatches kind of relatively to each other. So it's important to zoom in and zoom out and kind of look at faults compared to each other. Again, I always recommend, whenever possible, have that cable plant map next to you to make sure that the cable that you're wanting to shoot is the correct one. A lot of times you'll have multiple cables coming up out of the ground. If your plant map says it's supposed to be 250 feet and the TDR is saying it's 1,000 feet long, you're probably on the wrong piece of cable. So make sure you've got those two things kind of matched up. Cursor placement, we'll kind of show you again how in a later slide. This one, so this is a screenshot from on the Tracker Pro. You've got your primary waveform up top, and then you've got 3 measurement cursors, 1, 2, and 3. And then this is just a pretty typical example of you've got an open at the very end. The open signature is going above the baseline and then returning. And then you've got multiple splices. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 splices on that primary waveform. Cursor 1 is on the outgoing pulse. So this is a narrow outgoing pulse, and you've got your measurement cursor right on that leading edge or the left-hand edge. That's typically where the B and C connector on the front panel is. If you're using a test lead or a jumper cable, we always recommend using one to go from the TDR to the cable you're testing. That way you can get out past your blind spot of that initial pulse. I recommend using a 10-foot jumper. That way, if you want to subtract it in your head, if you're not able to move your cursor 1, if you use a 10-foot jumper, you can subtract 10 feet from the cable under test. Cursor 2 is showing at 136 feet. That's at one of the first splices. This is just showing an example that you always want to measure to the initial, where the left-hand edge of an event. So you can see here you've got the baseline, and then you've got a down, up, and then it's returning to the baseline, kind of an S-shaped curve. That's a pretty typical example of a splice. And you, like any other event, you always want to measure to the left-hand edge. Cursor 3 at 468 feet is showing an open. Again, you want to measure to that left-hand edge on any event. I'll show you some other examples of other taps and amps, different events that you might see in the plant. On this primary waveform, another thing I kind of want you to notice is you've got a splice, 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 and as they are traveling away from you, they appear to be getting smaller. That's an example, again, of that pulse of energy is dissipating over distance and going through events. So each of those splices are actually the same magnitude of an event. They're all good splices, but because they're close, the ones that are closer to you are reflecting more energy because they are closer to you. So it's really important to understand that when you're looking at faults on a piece of cable, understand that anything that's further away, if it's going to appear smaller, if it's the same magnitude, if it's actually appearing larger and it's further away, that's really it's a red flag to make sure that, that's probably the one you're going to want to go to first. So how do you attach your TDR to the cable that you're testing? There are many different ways. There's 3 basic ways. You can use alligator clips, you can use a test probe into the seizure screw of a tap, or you can break that cable off, core it, and put an F connector onto it. What's important to understand is there's not one way that's always going to be correct, but understand that what information you're getting, depending on the connection type, and what you're losing. So an alligator clip, there are good and bad ways to use an alligator clip. Again, remember that the TDR is measuring that relationship between those 2 pieces of metal. So if you've got alligator clips and you've got them, broken apart, and you're connecting to that piece of coax, that's creating a large impedance mismatch. So it's really screwing up the launch on the cable, having that impedance mismatch. So it's going to affect any events that are on that piece of cable. So if you're going to use alligator clips, which we recommend whenever possible, don't, but we understand it's the fastest way and sometimes it works great. But if you can, just twist those 2 tails of the alligator clips together to get them to be a consistent distance apart whenever possible. Again, that's going to be your fastest way to get onto a piece of cable and test it. But because you are getting a lot faster, that no matter what, that's not giving you your best connection. It's going to deteriorate the launch between the TDR and the cable you're testing. Another way, like I talked about earlier, is to use a test probe. So you can use a test probe from your jumper cable into the seizure screw onto a tap, and then whenever possible, break that off, because depending on the type of tap you're using, it might be going bidirectional, which can get very confusing. So whenever possible, pull that face plate off, and then a lot of times you can push, to be able to get into one direction. So this is a little hard to see, but on the left-hand side, this is a shot that we're using with alligator clips. You can see compared here to here, the left and the right at cursor 1, that launch is really noisy. That's an example of using alligator clips. Whereas on the right, you're getting a much cleaner connection. The outgoing pulse is much cleaner. Again, at cursor 2, on the left-hand side where the alligator clips, we're not really seeing any event right here. Whereas with the test probe, we are seeing an event. So just understand, cursor 3, we're still able to see the end of cable. With the alligator clips, we're able to see it. The same as on using test probe. You're not able to see some of those smaller faults. So this is just kind of an example of why it's better to use either a test probe, or the very best connection is getting an F connector onto that cable under test. But that takes the most amount of time. But just kind of understanding those changes. We kind of already talked about this. This is a standard piece of cable with splices and an open. Here's an example of 3 taps in a row. So again, you're seeing the first tap is your largest sort of fault, your largest event. The second tap is a little bit smaller. The third tap's, again, a little bit smaller. This is just kind of an example. I like using this as an example because a lot of times we're taught that if there's a problem with a piece of plant, break that cable off from both directions and just shoot the cable, just shoot the coax cable itself. Well, a lot of times the problem is there, but it might be somewhere else. A TDR can go through those passive devices like taps and splitters and whatnot, and the problem might be with the tap. So I always recommend, whenever possible, start from your widest location. Start and shoot the whole. You've got 3 taps in a row. If you've got 3 events right here, let's say the second tap didn't look like the other 2 taps. Maybe it was a little bit higher in amplitude compared to the first one. Maybe that signature just looks a little bit different. Well, probably that's where your fault is. Go in. I had a problem, this exact problem. We walked over to that tap, and the faceplate, which just wasn't screwed on tightly. We tightened it down, and that fixed the problem. There's lots of ways that plant can go wrong. Whenever possible, kind of have that zoomed out look. Or another example is maybe this span looks clean. There's maybe a little splice or a little problem right here, and then that looks clean. Well, I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time first looking at this piece of cable. I'd go through and break this cable out. And if you're seeing an event through a tap and you're still seeing it, pretty long distance away, that's probably an example of that's where your problem is. At that point, to get a little bit more narrowed down and make sure that your distance is accurate, I would break this piece of cable off, shoot it from both ends, and look for the problem right there. This example of power on the line. Whenever possible, when you're shooting a piece of cable, I always recommend taking RF and power off the line whenever possible. This is what power looks like usually. Also understand the TDR that you're using. Some TDRs are going to be safe to have power on the line. Some of them have power protection circuits. Some don't. So make sure you understand the tools that you're using. Let's say you do take power and RF off the line, and you're still seeing a little bit of noise. Any ideas on how that could be? Let's say it was aerial plant that you're shooting. You've taken power off the line, and you're still seeing a little bit of power. Any ideas? Well, I'm sorry, you were all talking. Anyway, well. Yeah, so like if you've got aerial plant and there's power line and 5 feet above you and you've got a fitting, this is what the guy was talking about earlier. Fittings can cause egress and ingress. So if you've got a fitting on that piece of coax that's loose and you're getting power transmitted through whatever means possible. I've had that same exact problem where the guy was like, hey, I took power off the line, I'm seeing a little bit of noise. I'm like, well. And he measured his 2 volts, and he was actually getting power from the power line coming through onto his piece of cable. So he tightened up all the fittings, and the problem went away. So this is another example of what power might look like. Again, it can be look a little bit different in amplitude depending on the tools you're using. Some TDRs actually have power filters. You can turn those on and off. I recommend whenever possible, if you've got a TDR that has the ability to filter out power, if you're really having a hard time figuring out what the problem is, if you've TDR'd it all looks clean, turn that automatic filter off. Sometimes turning off filters can help you understand where the problem is. This example, we've got a line extender at 2 and then an amp at 3. So all of these devices that we have in your plant, like amplifiers, those have electronics inside them. Okay, what's happening is the TDR is sending that pulse of energy into the amplifier, and it's absorbing that energy, and then it's reflecting back off of it. Well, it's converting distant time to distance. So those diodes, those transistors inside of that device, it's absorbing that energy and reflecting off of it. And sometimes some of those parts will take time to reflect that power back. So that's why you're getting that ringing sound. Is an amplifier 150 feet wide? No, obviously not. But that's why it's really important to understand that just because a TDR reflection may look like a wide fault, that does not necessarily mean that the event is 15 feet wide or 100 feet wide. It might be that you've got a piece of electronics that's gone bad, or you've got an amplifier and it's reflecting that power over time because it's converting that time to distance. Does that make sense? So again, different pulse widths are going to look a little bit different. So this shot is at 5 nanoseconds, and you're getting kind of an initial and then kind of a ringing. A lot of times an amp, if you go up to like a 20 nanosecond pulse, it'll have a really large, what looks kind of like a short, and then a big swale. So again, it's a good idea whenever possible, shoot it and look at it with different pulse widths, because some amplifiers may not show up on a narrow pulse, but if you increase your pulse width, it might jump off the screen. This is an example of active plant with RF on the line. So the RF is random noise. It's going to be very messy. So that's, again, a reason why, whenever possible, take RF off the line, especially if you're looking for smaller faults. Again, know the TDR that you're using. Some TDRs have the ability to do waveform averaging, so that noise, if you can average it out, it'll help kind of reduce the amount of noise on the line. Again, even with all the waveform averaging, usually you're not going to be able to see those really small faults. So whenever possible, take it off. But I always say, do the easiest thing first. Like I talked about earlier, shoot from the widest point of view. If it's safe, leave power and RF on the line to not get your customers down. See if there's anything that just seems obvious, and if not, then you can start to break things down. Decibels of return loss. So, can you guys see this side, or does it matter? Okay. Like we talked about earlier, you've got your outgoing pulse on your left, and if you had a perfect piece of cable with no loss on it, and you had a complete open, so all of the energy is being reflected back is exactly equal. Does anyone know what the return loss, what that number would be? Okay, it's 0, because there's no return loss. Most TDRs will have a decibels of return loss, a measurement on them. So if you had a perfect piece of cable, all of the energy is returning back to the TDR, you'd have a return loss of 0. Okay? But as we know, there are no perfect pieces of cable. So a more accurate description of what's actually happening is that pulse of energy is traveling down the cable, okay, and it's getting to a complete open. It's reflecting the energy back, and it's dissipating over distance. So that complete open, a total open, is going to be smaller than your outgoing pulse. And what the decibels of return loss is doing is it's subtracting your outgoing pulse compared to the reflected event that you're measuring, and it's giving that number. So let's say you've got a return loss of, DVRL. Sorry about that. DVRL. Decibels of return loss. Let's say you've got a number of 4, okay? And let's just say that is 100 feet. Okay? So, let's say so at 100 feet, let's say we had a return loss of 4. Now let's say we're measuring a piece of cable that was 200 feet. Is that number going to be higher or lower than 4? Are you going to have a return loss of higher or lower than 4? That's exactly right. The difference is greater less energy is being reflected, so that number is going to be higher. Let's say it's 14, okay? So the important thing to understand is that the smaller the number, the larger the event, okay? So let's say we had some splices. Now I've added some splices into that cable. Let's ignore this for a second. So before, we had a return loss of 14 with no splices. Now I've added some splices into it. Is that number going to be higher or lower?
Higher.
That's right. The number is going to be higher. It's going to be a smaller event at the very end. So it seems counterintuitive, but I'm just going to try to show you. So pretty typical. Cursor 3 at 468 feet, 24 dB. So with a splice is showing a return loss of 45, a very high number. It's a small event. Now, what's important to understand is that the return loss, it's not an absolute number. It's not an absolute measurement of an event, okay? Let's say, we're shooting at 136 feet. This exact splice is showing a return loss of 45 feet. Well, if I shot it from the other direction and it's now 300 feet away, it's going to have a different number. Even though it's the exact same event, it's going to have a different number, okay? So what's important to remember is that decibels of return loss is a ratio of multiple factors. I'm going to kind of get back to that slide. So it's not an absolute measurement of an event. It's a ratio of the pulse that you're using, the distance away that the event is, and then if there are any prior events. So all of those factors are what basically factor into the decibels of return loss. Top 10 TDR rules. Make sure you understand that how to use the TDR that you're using. A lot of times they'll come with an operator's manual or whatever it is, some YouTube videos. Call up your manufacturer's rep or the manufacturer themselves. Make sure you understand how to use your TDR. Get as close as you can get as close as you can to the fault that you are trying to look for. So again, shoot from both directions. Get a good quality connection whenever possible. I think we already, kind of remember that alligator clips are going to be the fastest, but they're going to give you the worst launch. Breaking that cable off, getting an F connector, that's going to be your best connection, but it takes the most amount of time. So just understanding what the connection types are telling you. Velocity of propagation. If you know what the manufacturer and the cable type is, a lot of times you can go to the list inside the TDR. That will get you close. Keep in mind that can change over time, temperature, humidity. So shoot from both directions again to get closer to that VOP. Begin with the narrowest pulse width. Again, even if you're shooting long pieces of cable, start with your narrow pulse and work your way up. Determine cable path and depth. That's another thing that's really important. Again, you can get your VOP 100% correct for that cable type, but keep in mind that it's traveling. A lot of times the TDR, the cable you're testing is underground. Understand that it's going down some distance. So when you're wheeling things off, we have a lot of factors that are out of our control, whether it's moving. So use your plant map whenever possible. Keep in mind, the depth and the path. Once you've got it fixed, a lot of TDRs now you can store a trace. Keep those traces whenever possible and tag them. Make notes so then you can compare old TDR traces. Once you've got it fixed, retest using a TDR and then compare those two to see if you fix those problems. If you guys want to jot down any of our information, if you've got any problems, even if you're not using a Springbok TDR, we know basically how all TDRs work. We're pretty familiar with, the tempos, the riser bonds. My family started riser bonds, so I might have built. If you have an old riser bond, I might have built it. So, call us up. Take our numbers down. We're out in the field a lot. I make our engineers go out in the field, so we're not, as savvy as you guys. We're not seeing it every single day, but most of the time we've at least kind of seen what you're seeing. So if you've got a problem, store the trace, download it, send it to us, and a lot of times we can help out. Any questions? Yeah, thanks very much, guys.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Hope y'all got something out of it. I know